traditional Chinese medicine or classical Chinese medicine, also going by the abbreviations of TCM or CCM. What do these two different terms mean? Is there a difference between them? And how is that relevant to you and your understanding? That is going to be the topic of this episode of Qi Life. Alright, so this topic came from a question from a student, as many of these topics on this Qi Life channel do. And I think it's one that might apply to a few people might be curious about, because I think a lot of viewers of this channel are clearly probably curious about Qigong, but are also likely to be curious about other related things such as Chinese medicine. And if you've explored some different information about Chinese medicine, maybe you've gone to different websites, maybe you've read different books, or you might have talked to different practitioners, you may have come across these two different terms: traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, or classical Chinese medicine, CCM. So in this vlog, I'll start by talking about some history about the development of Chinese medicine, particularly recent history, and then go into how these two terms are used and how that may or may not be relevant to you as you explore, well, Qigong and also topics related to it, such as Chinese medicine. So to begin with, Chinese medicine is thousands and thousands of years old. There are written references going back, a long, long time, and of course the practices preceded even written records of them. And over those thousands of years, of course, it has grown, it's changed, it's evolved. There have been different schools of thought that have risen up and then maybe fallen out of favor. There have been different practices within Chinese medicine that sometimes have been used more widely and then less widely at different points, and so on. So it has been a living, growing, evolving process in terms of what does the body of Chinese medicine include and what doesn't it include at different periods. And that's a natural thing for any body of knowledge, for any practice, for it to be growing, changing, and evolving. That's the way of nature. Now, during that time, it hasn't all been plain sailing. There have been different periods of turmoil and disruption, and there was a particularly big one relatively recently. And when I say it is relatively recently, we're not talking about last week or last month or even last year, but the Cultural Revolution really disrupted a lot of different Chinese practices. So certainly Chinese medicine, but also other things like Kung Fu, Qigong, and many other types of practice and knowledge as well. Many people died during the Cultural Revolution, and many others left the country because of all that turmoil and the political issues around that and so on. After the Cultural Revolution, things were at a pretty low ebb with regard to many practices, including Chinese medicine. And there was an effort put in to bring Chinese medicine back. Now, coming from that low ebb, it really took a lot of work, essentially, to piece it back together, drawing on whichever academics and practitioners were still around and their knowledge and whatever sources they could find to put something together. And as the Communist Party of China, the CCP, it's very much about centralized control, and so what it does with many things is it wants to come up with a standardized, party-approved version of them. And so this effort was put in to put Chinese medicine back together again so it could be practiced and the local Chinese population could benefit from that. But they wanted to have committees and things to organize this and come up with the official version of things. Now, as a result of that, you might imagine the way Chinese medicine was practiced after the Cultural Revolution in mainland China might be significantly different from how it was practiced prior to the Cultural Revolution. And so this new standardized version of Chinese medicine was promoted as traditional Chinese medicine, and not just within China, but actually overseas to some degree as well, through government connections, to sort of share this cultural knowledge from China. And I think that's a really worthy and worthwhile thing. But again, potentially some significant differences now that it's been through all that disruption and so on, from the way practitioners were continuing with their knowledge and practice that had maybe stemmed from China, but prior to that period of disruption. And this is where these two terms come from. So as people use them now, traditional Chinese medicine, well, I'll start with classical Chinese medicine. When people say classical Chinese medicine, they're generally specifically referring to Chinese medicine practices with roots and origins going back prior to the Cultural Revolution. Now, in the case of traditional Chinese medicine, though, it's not as cut and dried and simple as that, because certainly the Chinese government promoted this standardized version of Chinese medicine as traditional Chinese medicine. But also many, and I would say actually the majority, I'd go further, probably even the vast majority of people outside of China, including those practitioners who left prior to the Cultural Revolution, also referred to their practices as traditional Chinese medicine. So you've got this big pool of practices, including the way they developed and were standardized after the Cultural Revolution, being called traditional Chinese medicine. But you also have most people calling just Chinese medicine as a whole traditional Chinese medicine. And the reason why traditional Chinese medicine, distinguishing it from modern, because is it really Western medicine? But modern medicine, which was also being developed and used in China as well. It's not like they don't use other medicine and don't do their own research relating to sort of a more modern approach to medicine. So it's like any of that historical, cultural linked practices, which includes things like acupuncture and acupressure and herbalism and tuina types of massage and understanding of diet and Qigong and so on. Most people just class all of that as traditional Chinese medicine. But then there's this sort of emerging use of the term classical Chinese medicine. And, in many ways, that is a valid distinction to make, because there's been this different influence in how the practices and knowledge have developed. And so to be able to distinguish, okay, this, has a different background to it than this, that's a valid distinction to make. But again, very muddied by the fact that so many people actually just class all of that as traditional Chinese medicine. So what can we take from the use of, or people who use the term classical Chinese medicine? I think a lot of it's well-intentioned. They are trying to make this distinction. In my experience, though, often people who use the term classical Chinese medicine for what they do, as opposed to just traditional Chinese medicine, which is the far more common term, is that there are some things that are different about the way they do their practice, or about aspects of the theory and philosophy that they're using, compared to that standardized post-cultural revolution Chinese medicine, that was put together by certainly the process was overseen by the Communist Party in China. And they want to distinguish themselves, say, hey, we do things differently from that. The potential problem with that is, though, that, again, they're wanting to make this distinction. There can be a tendency for them to think that, well, they're doing classical Chinese medicine, therefore their way is the right way. And the reality of Chinese medicine, and all these practices, all these philosophies, Qigong, Kung Fu, all the related things, is that they're not monolithic. There isn't just one school of thought, one way of doing things. You go back to that period prior to the Cultural Revolution, and there were many, many different schools of thought and people doing things in different ways and understanding the theory and philosophy in different ways and emphasizing one thing or another. And all of them, according to this terminology, you could refer to as classical Chinese medicine. That's their roots, that's their origin. But but they're different from each other. And yeah, again, there can be a tendency when someone's trying to say like, hey, mine is better, mine is more right. But then it's like, yeah, but someone else is also from that, you could say, classical period, and theirs is completely different from yours, and they understand it very differently. But they're also classical. Who's right? So yeah, at this stage, I think it's an evolving use of the terms, and we might see that develop further. At this stage, it's, in my experience, it tends to be used, the classical Chinese medicine term tends to be used by people who are really wanting to emphasize their difference, and they do tend to start to fall into the category of, in my way's the right way, and not being so aware of all the many other approaches that also could be right and may just be looking at things in a different way. Most people just categorize all of that broadly as traditional Chinese medicine, but this could change over time. Particularly if there are more efforts to regulate the practice of Chinese medicine, it could be that there become some clearer distinctions about that, standardization of different aspects of things, and at that point, I think that distinction becomes more useful to people looking, because it's like, okay, distinguishing the standardized from the maybe non-standardized, in which there is a lot more diversity. And look, there's benefits to both. There is benefits to standardization, but there's also benefits to diversity. And so I'm not saying that it's a bad thing to standardize, and I can see why the Chinese government wanted to do that, to produce something standardized so that so that their population could benefit from it. Because one of the things that standardization does is it allows you to do things on a larger scale with more consistency, and that can be a good thing. If you think about, I think a good analogy for this is growing crops, right? So when we standardize different crops and we can grow them on a larger scale with systems and so on, that does allow for a greater amount of food production. The flip side of that, if we go too far in that direction of standardization, we end up reducing biodiversity too much, and that then makes those crops more vulnerable to diseases. It means that the balance in the soil can get out of balance more easily, because you're maybe just planting the same crop all the time, and you're not having different plants come in and do the different things that they do to the soil, and so on. So I do think there's a balance there, where it's not that standardization is a bad thing. Far from it. It can be really useful, but it's unhealthy to go too far in that direction. It's like so many things. Things can be useful, but they become unhealthy when we go too far in that direction. And so preserving that diversity, and again, in the terms of crops, biodiversity, is so important to the resilience of the whole system, because it creates this base, this reserve of, for plants, it's genetic knowledge, of different things that can be, at some point in the future, actually, we need some of those genes, and there's a pool of them available. And in terms of practices and philosophy, to have, have these different things there. And again, they can, like, hey, this standardized version, it's working pretty well for some things. But we need some different knowledge. What can we draw on? If those things have been pushed out too much by the standardization to the point that they wither and die, that's not there to be drawn from at some point in the future when we need it. I think it's, overall that diversity is a strength. And so to have these many different approaches, and this means that people will see things differently. They'll have different ideas of different practices, different ideas about different aspects of philosophy, is really, really healthy. This is the natural way to have these different things occurring and essentially competing with each other to some degree. We're competing in a healthy way to allow the most useful to come to the surface and provide the most good, the most benefit. So how is this relevant to you? Well, hopefully this gives you some context, some understanding, what people mean when they say TCM or CCM or traditional Chinese medicine, classical Chinese medicine, how you might look at it right now, that it's not actually necessarily a hard distinction between CCM and TCM, because so many people use TCM to actually describe all of that anyway. But to understand where people are coming from when they say CCM or classical Chinese medicine, that they're referring to sort of pre-Cultural Revolution sourced practices. Okay, hopefully that's useful. I look forward to seeing you on another vlog soon.